Hey guys, want to hear about a visual novel that includes necrophilia, incest, torture, gang rape, mutilation, and impalement? Doesn't that sound great? Yeah, but in all seriousness, the story I'm reviewing today is really graphic. I've probably turned a lot of you off the story already, and that was my general intention because this story is not for everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present the post-apocalyptic tale, Swan Song. It's well written and fully worth a read, but only if you have a strong enough stomach. Swan Song takes place after a giant earthquake has rocked Japan, and maybe the rest of the world too? It's never that well explained, other than that our protagonists are in an earthquake-ravaged city and there won't be any help coming from outside. Also, to make the setting a bit cheerier, the earthquake happens in late December in the middle of a blizzard, just to make the odds of survival that much better. Our protagonists are mostly university students. Hooray for the acknowledgement that life exists outside of high school, and the story follows their struggle to survive in a post-apocalyptic setting. Oh, also, lest I be misleading through this description, most of the conflict in the story is not based around man versus nature, but man versus man. The disaster seems to have done a pretty good job bringing out everyone's inner psycho, and guns and swords and pointy sticks kill a lot more people in this story than hypothermia, disease, and starvation do. So, Swan Song does something interesting with its narration where it rotates who's narrating the story between 5 of the main characters, and you also get to make choices as each of the narrating characters. Foremost among the narrating characters, we have our lead protagonist, Tsukasa, who's easily identifiable in that role as he has the most narration time and is the most boring character. Also, as a quick backstory, he was a prodigy pianist before he injured his hand and his dad was an abusive douchebag. The other 5 narrators include Hibari, an annoying bitch, Takuma, a fatataku, Yuka, who's kind and almost as boring as Tsukasa, and Shin, an easygoing badass with a katana. Now, it should be noted that these descriptions only describe each of the characters at the beginning of the story because they all change a lot by the end of it. Hibari actually becomes likable, Yuka gets a personality, Takuma grows a spine, and then later, well, discussing his character changes any further would actually be getting into really big spoiler territory. Anyways, suffice to say that at the start of the story, I would have been happy to see this entire group die off, and by the end of it, that was only true for one of them. Also, I should mention that there is a 6th member of the group who never gets any narration time, a cheerful autistic girl called Arue, and while she never leads the story, she is equally important to the plot as all our other protagonists. Swan Song does a great job depicting the immediate aftermath of a global calamity. It never shies away from the impact such a calamity would have, and explores some very dark topics like mob rule, genocide, and PTSD in a mature manner. While doing this though, it manages to avoid the trap of reader apathy by keeping just enough moments of levity that the story doesn't become a complete depression fest, and giving you at least a couple of characters who are likable enough to really get invested in. Another factor that helps this story is that it has the best pacing of any visual novel I've read. It starts off fast, and it never really slows down. I ended up marathoning the entire story in 2 days, and probably would have done it in 1 if I didn't have some pesky schoolwork. Lastly, I feel like Swan Song does a very good job at never dehumanizing any of its characters. It's certainly true that there are a number of characters who perform brutal and reprehensible actions in this story, but the writers are careful to demonstrate that these are just normal people who don't know how to deal with the extraordinary situation they find themselves in. This is particularly true for the main antagonist, who emerges later in the story. The writers take a long time developing his character, and watching his slow transition from a sympathetic guy to a complete psychopath is one of the most interesting parts of this story. The most obvious thing that some people will have a problem with for Swan Song is, that as discussed in the intro for this video, it has a lot of content that is quite frankly disturbing. I don't think it ever goes out of its way to try to be traumatizing, but I'm sure some readers will be anyways. Also, it contains some scenes which are just bizarre. One example is Takuma giving a "woe is me, life is terrible" monologue, while the happiest, cheerful music is playing in the background. Having music like that in the background while discussing all of life's misery is something that really should be reserved for Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh and no one else. That scene, though, pales in oddity compared to another one where Arroway dances around, naked, in the snow, in the middle of winter, with menstrual blood streaming down her leg. I really don't know why the writers chose to include that particular scene, whether it was supposed to be artistic character building, or just a really poorly advised attempt at fan service, but regardless, it made me sit back and think, what the bleep am I reading? Lastly, Swan Song shares a pet peeve of mine with another similar visual novel, Ji Senjo no Mao. Both stories have genius musicians as one of their protagonists. These protagonists have years of training behind them, and there's a reasonable discussion of music in the story, but we never get to hear them play so much as a note. In Swan Song, there are quite a number of times where Tsukasa plays the piano, but we never get to hear the audio for it. Would it really have been that difficult to add a bit of classical piano music into the game? Just having silence in those portions feels really odd. I have no problem saying straight up, if you've never read a visual novel before, this should not be your introduction to the genre. If you're not comfortable with gore, you should not read this. If you're not comfortable with sexual violence, you should not read this. And if you're looking for a light read, you've definitely come to the wrong place. All that being said, I personally found Swan Song to be a fascinating read, and I definitely recommend it to anyone who's sufficiently desensitized to sex and violence. If you've already read Swan Song and are looking for something similar, then I would recommend the aforementioned Ji Senjo no Mao. Although it initially starts out with a high school setting, the story and tone become quite similar to Swan Song as it progresses, and this is especially true for the final arc of the story. Anyways, that concludes my review. Thank you for listening. Cheers!